You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 16th of December 2024 on Monocle Radio.
It's 1 a.m. in Jakarta, 2100 in Damascus, 1800 here in London and 1300 in Washington, D.C. That's the time on Monocle Radio, brought to you by Chanel Watches. Israel intends to plant its flag deeper on the Golan Heights. Is Turkey or anyone else willing or able to end Sudan's war? And at what age should children have absorbed that flying reindeer parking a cart at every chimney on Earth in one night is, on considered reflection, unlikely? I'm Andrew Muller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. My guests Yasmin Abdul-Majid and Alex von Tunzelmann will discuss the day's big stories, and we'll hear from the DJ and producer Sasha about his immersive celebration of Leonardo da Vinci. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller, and I am joined today by Alex von Tunzelmann, the historian, author and screenwriter, and by Yasmin Abdul-Majid, the Sudanese-Australian writer and broadcaster. Hello to you both.
Hello.
We were discussing, and we will now continue to discuss Christmas plans. We can bring the listeners along with us. Alex, what are you doing?
Well, it's a very simple situation, actually. We're staying in London, and my mother and her partner are coming to join us. So hopefully that'll be very nice.
You say hopefully.
Well, I don't want to risk anything. No, well, I think, obviously Christmas can be, for some people it's a time of joy. For some people it's a time of stress. And, not everybody loves it in the same way. But hopefully I think ours should be pleasant. If everything comes according to plan, we'll see how my cooking goes.
And for our listeners who at some point over the season, Alex, may wish to get away from the relatives and perhaps tune into, I don't know, some sort of historical podcast, have you anything you could recommend to them?
Well, I'm not sure it's the most festive, but yes, I have this year just released a podcast called The Lucan Obsession. It was on Radio 4, but it's now just sort of on everywhere you get your podcasts. And it is a 10-part investigation into 50-year-old murder of Lord Lucan's nanny and then his subsequent disappearance. A great mystery that still intrigues people. Dun, dun, dun.
And I think there will be a lot of people at this time of year who will be wishing they too could disappear, I suspect.
Indeed,
as well. So
and whose families might also be quite dysfunctional at that point.
So possibly some hot tips. Yasmin, this is a time of year at which many of our fellow citizens who are living in Europe, myself included, will be spending a long time on an aeroplane. But you, unafraid as ever to buck prevailing trends, will be spending a lot of time on a train.
Indeed. So this year, my husband and I have decided, well, he doesn't actually like to fly. So I've been trying to convince him to get on planes. But, he says it's the environment. I know it's his anxiety, poor thing. Anyway, not to air out all this. Anyway, we're going from London through Slovenia.
Big hello to Yasmin's hideously embarrassed husband if he's tuning in.
So I was thinking overnight, I mustn't embarrass my husband on the radio. For some reason, I just felt like I was going to do such a thing.
That ship has sailed.
Here we are.
Yep.
Here we are. So we're going through Slovenia on train. There is a little section of rail replacement buses, but we're going to ignore that because there are engineering works throughout the festive season. But no, I'm quite excited. I've never been to Slovenia before. It's meant to be very beautiful.
It is.
Yeah.
This I can confirm. Extremely foggy.
Extremely foggy.
Well, I remember that it's extremely foggy, but I may be remembering it more because the defining motif of my last trip to Slovenia was the photographer complaining absolutely incessantly, if not unreasonably, about how foggy it was.
Well, hopefully it won't be foggy, given that, although this time last year we did try to go to Bosnia, and then we ended up cancelling the plans because apparently the air quality was so poor that they were telling people to stay inside. So hopefully it won't be foggy this time around, and we'll see some good views.
Well, I look forward to hearing all about it when we are all back, but we will start properly in what is technically part of Syria, but may be becoming practically less so. Israel's government has announced plans to expand settlement building on the Golan Heights, the Syrian plateau seized by Israel during the Six-Day War of 1967 and annexed by Israel in 1981, though this annexation remains unrecognised by anyone anyone except the United States. In the days since the toppling of Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad, Israeli troops have moved into the demilitarized zone between the Golan and Syria and taken some abandoned Syrian military positions. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu wants to double the Golan's population, currently circa 20,000 or so. Alex, first of all, he said this out loud. He wasn't subtle about it. He did say the Golan will be Israel for eternity, I think were his exact words. This is him underscoring that point.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think a kind of extraordinary factor of this story is that, Syria's government has only just fallen. I mean, it's been so quick. And Israel has already basically taken out pretty much all of their high-level military and equipment. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the major concerns about this, aside from the issue of the Golan itself, which is a major issue, as you say, and, is still very disputed territory, is that there will now be a question of if and when a new Syrian government emerges, how on earth are they going to defend their periphery? Because their military capacity has been more or less taken out by Israel.
Indeed it has. And again, Yasmin, Israel hasn't been abashed about their reasons for doing that. They wanted to destroy all Syria's kit, lest it fall into the hands of somebody who might point it at Israel, which from Israel's perspective is probably not an entirely unreasonable view of things. But do we get the sense, or are we starting to get the sense that Israel, they sort of understood what they were dealing with the Assads? They may not have liked him and he may not have liked them, but they had 54 years of the devils they knew.
Yeah, I mean, that definitely might be an argument that the Israelis would say at the moment. They were sort of preemptively trying to put ourselves in a position where whatever ends up, whatever the new Syrian government ends up looking like, we're in a position where we're sort of, we're on the front foot. However, I mean, the sounds that have been coming out from Syria, and yes, there isn't an official government, sort of an interim government, has been rather conciliatory. It has been, we're not interested in a new fight, we're rather war-weary. And so this is all language that the Israelis are saying we don't believe, but the rest of, Western allies of Israel have been hopeful about, because ultimately they're not interested in sort of entering another more combative relationship. And I do think that rather than Israel sort of seeing this as, well, we knew what we were dealing with Syria, it's an opportunistic move. It's an opportunistic move. And also it was kind of the way, it wasn't just we'll take out the chemical weapons, we'll take out everything. And frankly, I mean, under international law, is it the case that you can just take out a foreign nation's arms because you fear what they might do? That tends not to be the way that things should be done.
It has, however, though, Alex, been the way Israel usually has done it. They have always pursued a doctrine of decisive, often completely disproportionate preemptive action against what they see as a potential threat, which they tend to justify through a combination of history and their geography. Their point is, and again, if you look at the map from their perspective, their geographic reality is that we don't get a second strike.
That's certainly how some Israelis would look at it, for sure. But I mean, it's been interesting to see that there have been differences within Israel, even over this policy and over the policy on the Golan. When you had Ehud Olmert come out and say that he didn't think this was necessary, that he was against it. The idea of expanding the settler population in the Golan Heights is very tricky. That's got those 20,000 people who live there. I mean, it's a pretty small population, as you say, but a lot of them are Druze Arabs, not necessarily going to be hugely thrilled about loads of Israeli settlers turning up. I mean, that's quite a difficult thing to achieve. And you've already got, again, looking at it from the Israeli perspective and, not bringing into it lots and lots of other moral questions about this. Israel's already fighting a war effectively on two fronts, in Gaza and Lebanon, and this brings in a third. And I think that's pretty huge for a small nation to be dealing with all in one go.
Israel would probably, Netanyahu certainly would probably add Yemen and Iran to those fronts.
Absolutely, yes.
As well. The question of the Druze is an interesting one, though, Yasmin, because they have lived there a long time, often reasonably harmoniously. Some Druze Arabs do volunteer to serve in the IDF, and there are some reports of Druze living in Syria near the border who have actually made outreach requesting to be annexed to Israel because they would rather live there than in Syria.
Yeah, it is a complicated history, isn't it? I mean,
just a bit.
Just a little bit. Just a little bit. I'm not sure we'll cover it entirely in this segment, but it is. And I mean, ultimately, as Alex mentioned, the challenge is that it's not a uniform position. Whatever your thoughts are about the Golan, the Druze there will have will have different views. The sort of settlers, yes, might have one unified view, but I do think that it'll be a challenge, even thinking about what it would look like to, and Netanyahu did sort of say in the English version of his statement that this was sort of a temporary move, but in the Hebrew he said, he didn't use the word temporary, and it's always useful to pay attention to what he says in Hebrew instead. And so we are looking at a move that will change the composition of that area, and it isn't entirely clear how that'll play out.
I think across the Arab world, Yasmin, there was an amount of mirthless laughter at Netanyahu's use of the word temporary.
Yes.
We have heard variations on that one before. But just finally, before we move off this one, Alex, Yasmin referred earlier to the somewhat less blood-curdling rhetoric we have heard from Syria's new provisional rulers. I suspect that they've been doing some fairly serious media training prior to mounting their offensive. They have been at pains to come across as very much not the Al-Qaeda affiliate they started life as. They have made all the right noises about, plurality and Syria's diversity, have even used the elections word. At what point do you think we need to start maybe believing some of it?
Well, I mean, the fact that they're even saying it is really interesting. The fact that they feel that they need to do this, even if that isn't necessarily where they started or anything, tells you something about the fact that they clearly want functional relations with the West as well as their own region, that they want this to be a very different situation. I think, Yasmin made the correct point that I think a lot of people in Syria are straightforwardly, they've just had enough of living in a conflict scenario. And I think if there's any chance of bringing the country together, then there's going to have to be a certain level of plurality and, at least some sort of nod to democracy. Because, people just want to live an easier life that isn't so horrendous as the decades they've had under the Assads. And internationally, there's so clearly a warm reception for that I think if that can be sustained, then I don't see any reason why that can't work, unless the regional troubles get in the way of it.
Well, let's look now at Sudan, which since April 2023 has served as an ongoing lesson in the world's extremely capricious attitude to which conflicts it pays attention to and which it does not. One recent report suggested that more than 60,000 people have been killed and perhaps 13 million displaced by the fighting, mostly between two rival factions of Sudan's military. The United States Special Envoy to Sudan, Tom Perello, has painted an extremely bleak picture, suggesting that war is continuing because actors inside and outside Sudan are profiting from it politically and or financially, and that complete state failure and or partition are not impossibilities. Yasmin, we've talked to you at various stages since this began in April 2023, and I remember you saying that a lot of Sudanese, especially those in Khartoum and the bigger cities, were extremely surprised that this had befallen them because war in Sudan tended to happen elsewhere. Those friends and family that you have in Sudan, how surprised are they now that this is still going?
It's interesting. I was writing a piece just on the weekend about this, interviewing someone who worked at the university, one of the major universities in Khartoum, and she said to me, when the war began, we all thought it would be a couple of days, and I remember my own family members and similar saying it would only be a short while. But I think speaking to experts and to folks who had a little bit more of an understanding of the dynamics, perhaps, that were not obvious from the beginning, ultimately, yes, militarily, the militia might not have had the sort of air cover, and everyone sort of assumed that because the traditional armed forces had air support and so on, they had more military power, that they would be quickly dealt with. The militia would be quickly dealt with. We're now in a situation where you've got effectively two military kind of industrial ecosystems entirely fighting over a nation which is sort of falling apart. But because there's enough coming in from the outside and they are able, an interesting fact is Saudi has increased its livestock import from Sudan over the last year. So despite the fact that there is a war, Saudi is still importing livestock from Sudan because the militia sees that it's important to continue making money. So they send gold, they send livestock. Similarly, there's support from the armed forces from other allies. And so what you have is, as Tom Perello points out, the special envoy, there is no incentive for either side to end the war at the moment. And so what people are seeing on the ground, people that are on the ground and people that have left, is this sense of tragedy, this sense that unless something shifts, unless a major thing shifts, unless there's some sort of the question of what it would take for a major thing to shift is a question mark. But unless a major thing shifts, we're looking at a multi-generational conflict because of the ways that now this is a self-sustaining issue. And I mean, the RSF, the Rapid Support Forces that hold a lot of the West and some of the South, they've been talking about setting up a government. You know, the Sudanese armed forces have recently talked about create like a currency sort of flip so that people who are in the RSF-controlled areas of Sudan are not able to use the sort of regular Sudanese currency anymore. So people are sort of rushing to the bank to try to put their money into banks and so on. And so you're looking at a situation that when I first heard the idea of partition, I thought it couldn't be possible. We could not be facing
it. It has happened
but
already
once. It has
once.
happened before,
Yep.
right? It has happened with South Sudan in my lifetime, not that long ago. And so it could, like, the fracturing is a real tragic possibility.
Alex, we have also heard President Recep Tayyip Erdogan of Turkey kind of piping up on this recently, who does seem to be increasingly interested in asserting himself in East Africa. Clearly, he has already in recent weeks asserted himself to a degree, the complete extent of which remains not entirely discerned, but clearly there was some Turkish involvement in events in Syria. Does Turkey have the kind of heft necessary to bring about any kind of settlement in Sudan? This is one of those situations in which people traditionally look to the United States, who for one reason or another, I suspect, aren't going to be much interested.
No, I don't think they're going to get involved. I mean, especially not given they've got a new president coming in next month who I doubt could be less interested in the fate of Sudan, to be perfectly honest with you. I mean, we'll see is the answer on Turkey. It's interesting. I mean, Erdogan obviously is seeing himself as a sort of power broker in the region, which is interesting. I mean, obviously, you could go back as a historian, I'll sit there and say, well, you know, the Ottoman Empire did kind of exist. And, you know, culturally and historically, Turks do feel like they have some kind of role in the region like that is, you know, that does kind of reach out to these directions. Whether he can do it or not, well, I think there are lots of factors in that. I think it depends a lot on things like, how do things go in Syria? Do we get a government that's friendly to Turkey? If we do, that's going to make him considerably more powerful regionally. If we don't, that's going to be different and very distracting for him. You know, there's a lot of pieces in that puzzle, is what I would say. I mean, you know, to be honest, I sort of think a lot of the world's leadership will be in the position of go ahead and have a go.
One of the things that's quite interesting is so Turkey recently played a role in brokering an agreement between Ethiopia and Somalia, which was quite interesting. And Erdogan took a lot of responsibility and used it to sort of say, look, I am the power broker and I can do things that, you know, even the African Union can't do, even, you know, so on. However, I think what's interesting is that's, you know, quite a simple case of, you know, an issue over sovereignty. Whereas what we're looking at with Sudan is very complex in terms of lots of, you know, you've got the UAE, Saudi, Egypt, Russia, so on. And so, I mean, you've got drones coming in from Iran. The RSF was using Colombian mercenaries not so long ago. You know, so you're really starting to see this mix. So somebody like Erdogan is looking at this. I don't know right now if he's kind of got the levers. However, there is a vacuum at the moment in the region, and the UAE is trying to position itself as the big boy in the region, right? You've got Saudi, but it's, you know, it's kind of facing more a little to the west, I think, with its moves, cultural soft power and so on. So I do think that Erdogan is seeing this as the, you know, if it's not going to be the United States, if it's not really going to be Russia because they're dealing with the Ukraine and so on, China has it isn't typically interested in the sort of geopolitics of the region. They're much more, I would say, practical in terms of what they want to get.
Extraction of minerals.
Yes, yeah. It tends to be a little bit more extractive.
Yeah.
There is an opportunity. However, the whether or not he can pull it off, I think, as you say, Alex, remains to be seen.
Because just finally on this, Yasmin, doesn't all of that, all the other things that other people want from Sudan, doesn't it become easier for them to get it if Sudan is peaceful and unitary and orderly? And I guess mitigating against that, is the problem with the war itself that both sides feel that if we don't win, we are done for?
100%. But both kind of sides and everyone at the moment is benefiting from the conflict. And if there is peace, if there is genuine stability and a sort of civilian government, which is what the people want, ultimately they understand that they cannot really be part of that. And so that would be the sort of end of what is possible for them. At the moment, the way they are approaching it is a very extractive, very sort of, winner takes all. And the other thing I should note is both sides think they can win this militarily. And that's the problem, because it is a political conflict, not a sort of one that will be won militarily. And until that is understood, we're still in the stalemate.
Well, to Australia, which has welcomed home the remaining 5 of the prisoners once known as the Bali Nine. The 9 were arrested in Indonesia in 2005, attempting to smuggle heroin out of Bali. The 2 adjudged the group's ringleaders were executed by firing squad in 2015. 1 other died in prison, and another, the only woman among them, was released in 2018 after serving 13 years. Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, though doing his best not to turn their return into a media circus, did make a public statement thanking Indonesia's newish president, Prabowo Subianto, for his compassion. Alex, the big question here is, what is Subianto up to? Because it doesn't seem like him, and it certainly doesn't seem like Indonesia. It is a very big break from his predecessor, Joko, who maintained the incredibly hard line against drug dealers and drug traffickers.
Maintained it, and indeed, as you mentioned, in 2015 had 2 of the Bali Nine executed in what was a very dramatic and shocking moment at the time. I mean, so didn't just maintain, but kind of upped, if anything, the stakes after they'd already spent, 10 years in prison at that
something
point.
Something like that.
So this is a very interesting move. Well, it does tell us something, surely, about Indonesia wanting the new Indonesian government wanting quite a different relation with Australia and so on. I mean, the Australian government, of course, has been pressing for this ever since it happened, has wanted this to happen. And, Indonesia's had its own agenda on that. I don't want to kind of read so much into it that it becomes ridiculous, but quite clearly this is it's such a big change of tack on this. Now, I'm sure what they're not signalling here is drugs are fine now, kids do what you like. But I think what they are signalling is almost certainly we would like more friendly and easy relations with some of our regional neighbours, and perhaps Australia in particular. I mean, and that, even at the cost of whatever our position on this is, we just want that one solved. So, I mean, that's kind of interesting. It indicates for the new government a kind of perhaps, less, I mean, as I say, not necessarily less of a hardline agenda domestically, but internationally, sure.
Hey, is it a relationship, Yasmin, that Australia and indeed Indonesia could actually be making more of? It does always strike me that aside from stories such as this about Australians having mishap of some sort or another in Bali, you can spend a lot of time in Australia without hearing or reading anything about Indonesia on the news at all, and yet it's just there. It's this absolutely enormous country in which, I assume, no end of stuff happens.
There is a lot going on, one would assume. And I mean, I do think this is a really fascinating, it's always been a kind of quirk of the Australian kind of psyche. It sort of emotionally thinks it's in Europe, but physically it is in the Asia Pacific. It's closest, or one of its closest neighbours is Indonesia. It has loads of migrant students coming from, the Asia Pac region and Asia more generally. And so it is, I'm hoping that this signals a change in that relationship. It is a bit of a peacemaking, it is a bit of a peace offer, one could say. And it also comes at a time, frankly, when Australia does need some friends in the region. Ultimately, there were some reports of the numbers of Indonesian students coming to Australia has been decreasing over time. Obviously, the relationship with China has its ups and downs and various tenuosities over the years. But I do think that a closer relationship or a more understanding relationship with Indonesia can only serve Australia well. Whether it will benefit Indonesia, I think, is a question mark. I think in most Indonesians, this is a sweeping statement, but but most Indonesians would think of Australians as the Australians that come to Bali, right? And that is not necessarily the shining beacon of intellectual heights, that Australia could have.
Complaints as usual addressed to Yasmin Abdul-Majid directly.
I'm really doing well tonight.
Possibly just as well you're not going home for Christmas. Alex, it may also signal Subianto thinking that a president of Indonesia should perhaps be more of a global figure, which, again, is not an outrageous thing to assume. A president of Indonesia is president, head of state, commander-in-chief of an absolutely enormous and very important country.
Yeah, it's completely huge. I mean, that's one of the points, indeed. And I mean, the world is in the middle of rather a shake-up in terms of how those power structures and how things work. I mean, Yasmin mentioned that, for instance, China is moving in interesting ways. I'm sure Indonesia is thinking about its regional position and kind of where its power lies and its influence lies there. And indeed, why shouldn't they think along those lines any more than anyone else should in that region? Yes, they are a very big country with plenty going on, as we said themselves. But, countries do grow by their international relations. And of course, they will be thinking about this. Yeah.
Just finally and quickly on this one, Yasmin, does Anthony Albanese, who is likely facing an election reasonably soonish, does he gain from this at all? Because my general sense is that Australians are not tremendously sympathetic to those who end up falling foul of the extremely harsh drug laws across Southeast Asia, because it is not like these countries do not advertise extremely clearly what will happen if you get caught with this stuff.
Yeah, it is. It's a very common, it is something that people are very well aware of, in terms of when you travel to these countries, what the consequences will be if you run afoul of the drug laws. Will Anthony Albanese benefit? I'm actually not sure. I think it's a historical story in a way, right? Like this was 20 years ago, and we've had Chappelle Corby, what a throwback! You've had all, the executions, and so this story has had many chapters. I think people will sort of see it as a potential plus, but I'm not sure it'll kind of be a big windfall. Also, because typically the relationship with Indonesia has kind of been, especially around these sorts of cases, a big megaphone, send our boys back or whatever. Whereas this has been a much quieter affair, and that's probably why it succeeded, because it was sort of done diplomatically and so on. And so maybe Australians will be like, well, he got something done.
Well, listeners tuning in through speakers which can be heard by small children may wish at this point to leap across the room, grab their radio or other audio device and fling it urgently out the window, lest the imminent discussion be overheard by their infant. A vicar conducting a religious education lesson at a junior school here in the UK has been compelled to apologise after telling a group of sobbing school kids aged 10 or 11 or thereabouts that Santa Claus is not in fact real, and indeed that whatever cookies they may have left out by the fireplace had likely been eaten by their parents. One suspects that we may look forward to an array of those glorious local newspaper photos of grumpy citizens with their arms folded. Alex, I'm going to say at age 10 or 11, how dumb are these kids?
I mean, really, I'm sorry. 5 or 6, maybe. 11? Come on. And don't kids today, I know people are whipping their smartphones off them and taking them off the internet as fast as they can, but surely by this point you've figured out. I'm sure I was a tiny child when I first sort of got up in the night to watch my grandfather stumbling downstairs in basically what was amounted to a sort of red bin bag and Santa hat, half drunk on
God, I never
snowballs.
Nobody in my family made that much effort. I don't recall how old I was when I figured this out. I did used to get a present under the artificial tree that we did grudgingly employ until one year that the dogs ate it and we never bothered to get it replaced. There would always be a present left out for Santa, but it did not escape my notice that Santa had handwriting remarkably similar to one of my parents.
Right? Come on. This is not a mystery for Agatha Christie, is it?
What about you, Yasmin? Were you ever a believer?
Well, I'm not sure that Santa, growing up in a Sudanese Muslim household, I think Santa wasn't a huge feature. But Christmas, as I've told you in the past, Andrew, the exciting thing at Christmas was, it was the one day of the year that McDonald's was shut, so we would always drive by to see if it actually was.
So nobody in Queensland ate anything on Christmas Day.
Exactly. What I'm curious about is what the Reverend said after. Did the Reverend say, Santa doesn't exist, but the devil does? Is that why the children were sobbing? Was it a sort of Grimm's tale?
Yes, I'd love to know if there was more to this. I I also do wonder, having met children, I do wonder whether they were slightly messing with their teachers here. You know, what if we all burst into tears for Daisy? Will he stop talking? Let's see what happens.
I mean, what disappoints me, having read extensively into this story, there doesn't appear to be any record of some absolutely insufferable 11-year-old sort of like brandishing a Bible back at him and saying, well, mate, if we're going to talk about things which don't actually exist or didn't actually happen, or that we
was
may
that
have
you,
been...
Andrew? Was that you in the class?
Totally was.
Honestly, yeah, it sounds like it might have been, because I think somebody who is a vicar for a living is on pretty thin ice here, and at that level, I'm sympathetic to the kids. Just in closing, I'll ask you first, Alex: are there nevertheless any Christmas rituals to which you have clung?
Very, very... I mean, my family's not very traditional about these things and not at all religious. So, I mean, very few. But on the other hand, I suppose... Oh, God, it's going to all sound incredibly woke. I mean, just...
Go on.
I think it's just sort of, it's sort of spend a bit of time with the family. That's basically it, until you sort of, a couple of days later you want to murder them and you can all go away again for another year.
So your Christmas tradition that you observe is restraining the urge to throttle your relatives?
Yes.
Yeah, okay,
we try and restrain it.
Yep.
Managed so far.
Yasmin?
Well, typically, I mean, I quite like the lights.
Okay.
Yeah. Given the fact that this is
a novelty coming from Queensland, obviously. Yeah.
Exactly.
Like the old school, like London Christmas lights. You enjoy those?
I mean, I think it's all just, again, having no relevance to me whatsoever. It's sort of it's a bit of an annual light show, and then you get to watch movies where people look very happy, and then you look outside and everyone seems quite upset, and you sort of chuckle and you wonder what's going on.
So your Christmas tradition is revelling in other people's barely repressed misery. On that festive note, Yasmin Abdul-Majid and Alex von Tunzelmann, thank you both for joining us. Finally on today's show, Grammy-nominated musician Sasha, often hailed as one of the world's top DJs, took on the unique challenge of reinterpreting the mind of Leonardo da Vinci through the lens of music for a 2022 immersive exhibition in Berlin. Since its debut, Da Vinci Genius and its accompanying score has been refined into an award-winning and regularly sold-out experience, moving to Amsterdam before recently opening in Mumbai and Florida. Monocle's Maylee Evans caught up with Sasha to talk about the project and began by asking how he first got involved.
And the guys behind the Da Vinci project came to me quite early on in the process. They were looking for a composer to collaborate with, and I did quite a few Zoom meetings with them, got to know the creative team, and then one of the directors of the financial guys decided they were going to go in a completely different direction. And they decided to work with this USA, I'm not going to name his name, but an American pop producer. And they had this idea that they wanted to juxtapose pop music and 20th century classics against Da Vinci's work, which I wasn't so sure that was the right direction to go, but this one guy who was running the show basically decided that's what they were going to do. Anyway, it just didn't work out with that producer, and they got to about 2 months before the show, and they called me and they said, we haven't got a score, we're not working with him anymore, can you help us? Yeah, so it didn't work out with the American producer, so they came to me sort of 2 months before the show was opening without a score and kind of panicking. So the first iteration of the show that launched in Berlin, I had about, I'd say like a month or five weeks to work on the music. So we did end up licensing quite a few tracks for the show in Berlin. There was a section that had Donna Summer, I Feel Love in it, and New Order, Blue Monday, and some other licensed music. And then I probably wrote about 50% of the music, the incidental music and the supporting music around it. And then the Berlin show ran its course, and then I thought that was kind of it with Da Vinci. I thought that was going to be it, but then it kind of got resurrected and reborn in Amsterdam, and they decided that they were going to re-edit the show, cut down some of the longer scenes that were dragging a little bit, and remove a couple of scenes, put some new stuff in, a whole new intro. Also, there was a section that I was quite vocal about, that I was like, because in the original Berlin show, The Last Supper appeared about a third of the way into the show. And it's such an overwhelming, powerful section of the show, because seeing the Last Supper on that size, it's like the walls were like 40, 50 feet long and 20 feet high. Seeing the Last Supper with the music together in that space was such a powerful moment. I felt like everything after that in the show, it had peaked a bit early, So, I lobbied to have the Last Supper moved right towards the end of the show. So the Amsterdam show was cut down to like 45 minutes and re-edited. And for Amsterdam, I had like 3 months to work on the music. So we really went into detail.
And talk to me about the cinematic inspirations. I read that Stanley Kubrick was Touchstone, but tell me about, I guess, the joining of image and sound and maybe what this director and others you look to, what was it about the way that they worked that you sort of wanted to imbue in your own score?
Yeah, I mean, I think Kubrick was the first thing we thought about because, the way that he always used classical music and sometimes juxtaposed modern images with classical music. 2001 Space Odyssey's prime example of that. But the concept of the show is that Da Vinci, the beginning of the show, Da Vinci is kind of looking back on his life. It's almost like he's on his deathbed and he's looking back across his life because towards the end of his life, in his notebooks, he scribbled down over and over, did I ever really achieve anything? Which is extraordinary considering, just the odd Mona Lisa and this and that and, submarine, helicopter, a few things he invented. And so, this concept of him kind of looking back on his life and wondering if he'd actually achieved anything is incredible to think. So the whole beginning section of the show is quite somber. It's quite dark and it has this feeling of, I guess he died with this feeling that he hadn't achieved enough, which was mental. And then the show opens, sort of 10 minutes into the show, it kind of opens up into the modern world and you see the influence that Leonardo da Vinci's had across time, across the 20th century, 21st century. So that's when the music gets very sort of electronic and futuristic. So we really wanted to balance, like, for example, when the first time you've seen the Mona Lisa, it comes from thousands and thousands of pixels all over the room and they congregate onto the center cube of the show and the Mona Lisa forms. So there's very much an element of using Leonardo's classical works and then screwing with them digitally and messing around, glitching them out. There's another section called portraits where the whole room fills up with his portraits and they all start to morph into kind of modern faces and glitch. The room starts to glitch out and it sort of turns into this sort of 8-bit video game towards the end of it. So trying to find a balance between the classical feel of presenting classical music, but then getting to play around with it, with the electronics and having fun in the studio, which is what we love doing.
That was Sasha speaking with Monocle's Maylee Evans about the immersive exhibition Da Vinci Genius. Tickets for the show in Mumbai and Florida, along with the show's score, are available now. That's all for this edition of the Monocle Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, Yasmin Abdul-Majid and Alex von Tunzelmann. The show was produced by Monica Lillis and researched by Maisie Ringer and Gunnar Grunlid. Our sound engineer was Alan Whedon. I'm Andrew Muller here in London. The Daily is back at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.